Well, hello, Thrivers. This is your host, Zaheen Nanji, and welcome to the Thrive in Life show. This is episode number 22, and I can't believe, when I just started, it was just a while back, and I thought, this is going great, but time flies. And my hunch is that if you're thinking, if this is episode number 2, and you enjoyed all the content that we have, which I'm sure you will wonder, I wonder what episode 1 to 21 is all about. Well, let me tell you, go to zahinnanji.com, what you see right here below. And for those of you listening on the podcast, go to zahinnanji.com and click on Thrive in Life show that you see there, and you'll see the whole list of episodes that we've had in the past few months. So I'm excited that today we're going to talk about how to cope with mental illness. And this is a subject where I find not a lot of people talk about. So I'm glad that I brought this up because it's all about thriving again. And for those of you just joining us, again, this is your host, Zaheen Nanji, and we are on episode number 22 on Google Hangouts, and for those of you listening on the podcast. Okay, so I'm going to introduce my guest now because we want to get right into it. Jason Finucan is an inspirational speaker on the topic of overcoming stigma and reducing the impact of mental illness. He had been or has been, I guess, right, Jason?
Yeah.
Been diagnosed with both a major physical illness, which actually led to an open heart surgery, and he's going to talk about that, and a mental illness. Today, he's going to share how these stories have especially made him really want to talk about the stigma associated with mental illness. He has worked with corporations and schools in helping them improve and manage the negative impacts of mental illness. Jason lives with his wife, Anna, in Quebec, Canada, and he's joining me now from there. Hi, Jason. Come on in and say hi.
Hi, Zaheen. Thank you very much for that introduction.
Hey, first of all, thank you for coming on the show and speaking about this, because I'm sure that, this is something that when you're asked to talk about, it may be easy for you, but for others who have an illness like that, I'm sure it's a little hard. So let's start by asking you, when was that time that you found out that you have a mental illness?
Yes, I was 26 years old when I first started experiencing the symptoms of the mental illness. Now, at the time, I had absolutely no idea what those symptoms were. Later, I would learn they were clinical depression and then hypomania, which is basically an elevated mood that doesn't go away for days and weeks at a time. You have more energy and you have more, you're almost restless, like you get less sleep. But during this whole time, I was feeling the effects, but really didn't know what it was. It wasn't until I was almost 30 that I was finally diagnosed in 2005 was when I was diagnosed as having bipolar disorder. So that's when I was given a name for the illness that I was fighting at the time.
And tell me how when you found out, how did that kind of get in your head? Like you must be wondering, what is that and why me? And how did you overcome that stigma? And also put in the story about the other thing that you had, which is the open heart surgery, and when that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. In one of my blogs, I actually called it "How for Me Mental Illness and Stigma Began with a Heart Defect," and it's a bit counterintuitive, but that's really what happened. I was only 9 years old, and I suffered from a congenital heart defect that didn't really appear symptom-wise until I was 9, and it was quite violent. I would have these attacks where my heart would race 200 beats a minute for up to 45 minutes at a time. And it was very debilitating. And ultimately, the only way to fix it was open heart surgery, which I had in 1988 when I was only 13. I was in grade 7. And I was fortunate that it was able to be fixed, basically. I mean, it was unfortunate that I had such a major illness at such a young age, but I was lucky that it was something they could repair, and they did. And at the time, I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think about stigma. I didn't think about anything because it just didn't exist around an illness like that. And when I went through the years from the first symptoms of bipolar until I was diagnosed, and even for a little while after, I experienced enormous stigma regarding that illness. And it really was only in comparing the two experiences that I learned that stigma comes from a place really of fear and of lack of understanding, and that it is something that we need to get rid of. Because here's the interesting part. I went through these two illnesses, and if you ask me which one would I be willing to redo, it wouldn't even think about it. I would take the open heart surgery rather than those years with bipolar, because the stigma was so much of a challenge. It made it so much harder. And I even had stigma, towards myself, because I didn't like the idea that I was potentially suffering from a mental illness. It was something that I even had some judgment towards others at the time. So really it was a lesson I learned the hard way, and I decided to become an inspirational speaker on the topic because I believe I can help others learn this lesson much more quickly than I did. That's the hope.
Right. So may I ask, I guess, how do you handle it now?
Well, since 2005, when I was diagnosed, right around that time was when I got over the stigma, and I stopped thinking about the illness in all these complex emotional ways. I really just started to approach it like it's an illness, and I need to approach it very straightforwardly. What do I need to do to get better? And in my case, this doesn't apply to everyone who has a mental illness, but in my case, I needed treatment. I needed to take medication. And once I found the right medication, I was able to take that treatment, and it, for me, was a significant improvement. It essentially shut the symptoms of the illness down. And once that occurred, from then until now, I do several things to try to manage my illness or limit the chances that it will come back or that I'll have a relapse. And many of them are common sense things that we all do or should do anyway, because it's just about living a healthy life. But the biggest ones are sleep. I really make sure I get a consistent amount of sleep. And if I have, let's say, 1 or 2 nights in a row where I only get 5 or 6 hours when my normal is 7.5, I don't let that pattern continue. I make sure I get back to my normal sleep routines. So that's a big one. And I live really moderately. I don't live like I always say to people in my talks, I don't live like a monk. I enjoy myself. I like wine. I drink wine. I'm not worried about that. But what I do is everything I do, if I eat, I eat well. And if I'm going to drink alcohol, I do it in moderation. And I try to make sure that I include physical activity in my life on a very regular basis. And all of those things, which are really just smart ways to live anyway, they do minimize the chances that you're going to have a relapse, because a mental illness is essentially a failure in the brain chemistry, that your brain isn't working the way it's supposed to, and it can be triggered into that state with stress or high levels of anxiety or very poor sleep or et cetera. So all of these things, if you can manage them, they can really help to minimize.
So when you talk about a relapse, have you gone through that in the last few years, and how have you managed to come back from that, Jason?
Yes, it's interesting because I was 7 years from 2005 until 2012 when I had my first relapse. So I had 7 years of absolutely zero symptoms, and I was getting quite used to it. It was
Nice.
quite nice. And the first symptoms that I had were, for me, they were on the depression side. I would experience mild to moderate depression, and it would start and it would last about 3 months, 2.5 to 3 months. And I could work through it, I could live through it, but it was difficult. And the difference was, though, when it happened, I didn't deny it to myself. I didn't try to hide from it. When it came back, I went to my doctor and I said, okay, well, this is what's happening. What do you think I should do? And over the course of a year, we changed my treatment. First, we tried increasing the drug that I was on. That didn't work. And when that didn't work, we simply reduced that and added a new one. And so this was a period of, from 2012 to the end of 2014, I had 3 episodes of clinical depression in the mild to moderate severity level. But we were working through it and trying to find a solution, and ultimately we did. And so for 7 years, I was able to go with just 1 medication. And from that point on, I take 2 instead of 1. And once it was worked out and we figured out the right dosage, I have been very well and haven't had any relapses since. So it was interesting because the relapse was not as scary as it might have seemed, because I knew what it was, because I didn't have any stigma, And because I built a support system around me, both in the way I manage my life, but also in my wife, Anna, she's fully understands my illness and fully understands what's needed. So I have that support with her, and I'm building a support system, obviously socially, if given what I do. People understand my illness much better because I speak so openly about it.
Mm.
And it really did make for a quicker return to health, I think, than it otherwise would have.
So it's almost like you're saying that it's easier when you do go through those, downtimes that you have, that it's easier if you were to accept what you have instead of, denying it. And then also to have the network around you. And then you said also to not go into the or to think about the stigma that much and not let that affect you. Yes.
100%. I mean, I would put it in a different order, because the first thing that happens is the reason that you would ever deny an illness, generally, if the illness is not life-threatening. Obviously, if the illness is life-threatening, you might deny it out of that simple reason. You don't want to imagine yourself and your mortality. But let's say it's not going to kill you. The reason you would deny it is only stigma. That's the only reason.
Oh.
If you or I were to be diagnosed tomorrow with a kind of cancer that has nothing to do with our lifestyles, we didn't smoke, we didn't do the wrong thing, we didn't live the wrong way, we just ended up with this weird form of cancer, we wouldn't deny it because we wouldn't feel guilty about it. We wouldn't feel like others would judge us for it. But if you have clinical depression and you don't recognize it as an illness in that same way, and you have that stigma, then the first instinct is to deny it and to try to hide from it or work through it. You sort of pretend that, oh, I can just push on and it'll be fine. And that's when the stigma really can cause you problems before anybody else has done anything. So that's a huge, huge part of it, is accepting it for what it is. It's an illness. It's no fun, and it's bad luck that you have it. But what are you going to do about it? You have to act the same way. And again, I'm fortunate that I can go back to that heart defect and the experience that I had, because every time something happens to me now, like when I had those relapses, I ask myself, what would I do if my heart problem came back? Would I not talk about it? Would I hide it? Would I feel guilty? Of course not. I would go to the doctor and I would get advice and I would follow that advice and I would act accordingly. And when I told my friends, yeah, my heart problem came back, I wouldn't worry about their judgment. And so I do believe that one of the ways stigma gets beaten is obviously from someone like me speaking out about it. That helps a lot. But it also is the person who's ill not letting it get to them. And if they speak openly, the people around them tend to follow. And that's what I've observed in my years of speaking about this. I do want to remind anyone who's listening, though, that I fully acknowledge, and I haven't forgotten, that it is not easy to do. And yes, it's easy for me to speak of it now because I've made somewhat of a career choice around it. I've decided that this is something I wanted to do, and I want to change the way we think as a society. But that was from 2003 when I first had symptoms until 2005 when I was diagnosed. I went through 3 or 4 years where I couldn't have imagined speaking about this publicly. I mean, I would never have done it. So it took a while to get there. But I just hope that I might have maybe cleared a bit of a path that people would feel more and more comfortable in doing so. Because for sure, when you think of your show and the theme of your show, to be resilient, you can't be resilient if you're not acknowledging the challenge you're facing, and if you're withering from speaking about it, and if you're not gathering support around you. You can't do any of those things if you're not facing up to it.
That's so true, Jason. And thank you for saying that, because that is all about acknowledging, accepting. And this is the same story as I have with my speech. I stuttered, and sometimes it still comes up. Even today in the show, I stuttered a couple of times, and in the past I would always hide it by using other words that I wouldn't stutter on, and things like that. But now I don't, and I find that the more I speak about it, and I share my story when I speak, that the more I share, the more it's the same way. It just takes away that stigma, or how people judge me, and now I don't even care anymore. And even when I stutter, it's It's almost like there's no emotional, charge to it, because it doesn't even affect me anymore. So thank you for saying that. And for those of you watching again and just joining us again, this is the Thrive in Life show, and you are listening how to cope with mental illness. And we're having great conversation, so stay tuned. And for those of you listening on the podcast, keep on listening, because Jason is going to share some amazing tools that he has with us, and he has something, a freebie, actually a gift that he's going to offer at the end. Okay, Jason, so tell me now. I didn't tell you this, before though, Jason, and I don't even think the viewers or the listeners who know me by now know this, is I have a half sister, and she also has a mental illness similar to yours.
Mm-hmm.
And when she was diagnosed, she didn't accept it. And I had a really hard time around her. I didn't know what to do and what to say. So what are the common, mistakes that, people who don't have the mental illness, or who don't know how to deal with it, what are some of the things that they do that they, really shouldn't do?
Yeah.
Or how do they deal with it?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. And I want to start this answer by saying absolutely everything I say is with full understanding that I've observed these mistakes over time, and I've made some of them myself. These mistakes are very easy to make. So when I say to you, try not to do it, it's if you think to yourself, oh no, I've done that in the past, don't feel bad about it, because unless you've ever meant to make someone who has a mental illness feel guilty, if that was your intent, that's a different story, but I'm sure it's not. Oftentimes the mistakes are just mistakes. They're unintended phrases or ways of saying things that end up making someone feel badly, and you don't mean to. So I'll give one example. I have a blog that I wrote called My Issue with the Word Issue. I have noticed that people tend with mental illness to use the word issue in a way that they don't mean it at all in this way, but it has an unintended, I think, perpetuation of stigma. And here's why. If your half-sister had cancer, you would never say the phrase, what's her name? Her first name?
Nilu.
Nilu. Okay, you wouldn't say that my half-sister Nilo has issues with cancer, because that doesn't sound right. Issues is something that you generally apply to a situation where the person who's having the issue has some control over the situation. So one of the phrases that I use is, you speak about mental illness as though the person is doing something about it rather than it's happening to them. They're experiencing it. So for example, the same situation, she doesn't have an issue with cancer, she's been diagnosed with cancer. Now just that simple turn of phrase makes it very clear. Cancer happened to her, and she's had the unfortunate situation or circumstance to have had that happen. And so if her illness is bipolar, why not the same way? She's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So it's the same sort of phrasing that allows it to be an illness that's happened to a person. So that's very important. If you're speaking about a mental illness, don't try to find soft words. The words are very, very straightforward. If you've been diagnosed with a mental illness, that's exactly the phrase. They've been diagnosed with a mental illness, and which one? Well, it could be clinical depression, anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder. There's many different ones. But find out what the name is and call it what it is, and not say that a person is having issues with it. That's one thing for sure. Another one is, we all, or many of us, can feel very uncomfortable about mental illness because you think, well, I don't know what to say to this person. And that's understandable. You're not sure. But if you let your discomfort take the lead, you may make that person feel, and I've actually been in this position, I've watched a person feel so uncomfortable talking to me about my mental illness when I was depressed, when I was sick, that I started to feel bad for them. And here I was concerned for their well-being when really they should have been concerned for mine. And they were concerned for mine, but their awkwardness led the conversation and it got in the way. So finding a way to get over it, and I believe the first point is one of the ways to get over it. Find the words and use them. And believe me, people will appreciate it. So don't let the awkwardness get in the way. And then this is a key one. Don't ever question a person's motives if they've been diagnosed with a mental illness. For example, their work ethic or their motives, as if to say, well, you've been depressed lately. Like, are you sure you're really trying hard enough? That's an old phrase that people say, and I've had said to me, and it is just, I can promise you this, for those of you who've never experienced clinical depression, if you can picture the worst you've ever felt, take the worst flu you've ever had that made your bones ache, and combine it with the saddest day of your life, whether that was a day when you lost somebody you cared about who died, or that was a day when a relationship ended that was very important to you, or you lost a business. Take the saddest day in your life and the worst flu in your life, put them together, and you have an idea of what clinical depression feels like. No one wants to be there. It's horrible. So if someone is there, you should feel empathy towards them, period. Not questioning or doubt or any of those things. And the reason people question or doubt is because, again, they don't understand the depth of that person's illness. And so they think maybe they do have some control over it. Or maybe it is, an emotional reaction to something. And when you hear the phrase clinical depression, what that actually means is that the mood, depression, has now gone beyond what makes sense on an emotional level, because we all get depressed. There's nothing wrong with that. If we have a good reason to be depressed, we should experience that and work through it. But clinical depression happens when sometimes there's nothing to be depressed about, and also it lasts much longer than it would in any way make sense. So instead of a day or two, it could be weeks, or in my case, it was actually months at a time that I would experience it. So that's important to recognize as well, is that this person's trying. I guarantee you, they do not want to feel the way they feel. They're trying to get out of it. And so those mistakes are things that are very natural and easy to fall into. And I believe just understanding a little bit more about mental illness will make you hesitate. And the last thing that I say to people is a way to avoid these traps, almost every one of them, is to simply imagine that whatever it is they have, whatever mental illness they're struggling with, replace that mental illness with cancer. And then ask yourself, what would you say? You almost invariably will never say the things you shouldn't say. It's that simple. So it's a good way to catch yourself.
So then just to recap, you just want to call it the way it is, right? So that, this way, then it's not awkward or anything like that. And just empathize with them. That I found really good. And I liked how you described depression versus clinical depression. And I will tell you, I made the mistake of, just being awkward around my sister. I just felt like I was, walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know how to deal with it. And I just wanted to help her. And I felt that I couldn't. So I can see where I made the mistakes. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's so easy to do. And let's remind ourselves as well that if a person is in the hospital and they're dying of cancer, as an example, it's not fun to go and talk with that person, because you still feel the awkwardness. You still feel the sense of, what do I say? But what I challenge people with is, you get over it. You find a way through that awkwardness and you care for the person. You don't walk into their room and go, I feel uncomfortable, so see you later, and walk out. You just don't do that. You find a way through. And so that's something that I feel, if we start to equate mental illness with what it is, an illness, and it's a physical illness of the brain. That's all it is. And it's affecting the person's mood. If once we equate it with an illness, we start to clarify in our minds, how do we speak about it?
Yeah, that's great. Now, because we're almost close to the time, I really wanted you to share about 3 to 5 tools that you can share with the viewers and listeners on, especially if they are, going through some kind of mental illness, or if they know someone who is going through that, how to manage it or how to help the other person cope with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously the number one thing we just talked about is empathy. So every approach to the person who has the mental illness, if you're a caregiver, you need to have that empathy be forefront. And frankly, if it's you who is suffering, you need to have empathy for yourself. So you're not adding criticism to your own illness that you're going through, because that's very easy to do. So that's number one, is just to be empathetic for the situation, which is hard. The second one is to track. And by track, I mean this. The 2 biggest factors are your sleep, which you can track very, very easily. So figure out what is your norm for sleep. Are you a 7 hours a night? Are you a 4 hours a night? I mean, everybody has a different and often wildly different amount of sleep they need, but there is an amount of sleep you need. Whatever it is, figure it out and then track it, and make sure you don't have too much or too little for too long. That's a simple phrase. Don't have too much or too little sleep for too long. And so if you have 10 hours a night when you normally get 8, don't do that more than 2 nights in a row because it will throw you off. And so tracking your sleep, which you can do very easily, I actually did it in Excel. I created a simple Excel sheet and I tracked it, and I found that very helpful. And the other thing you can track is your mood. And again, this is where you need to be careful. I'm not talking about, are you in a good mood today or a bad mood? Are you cranky? Are you frustrated? I'm not talking about the everyday life moods. I'm talking about, what is your baseline mood? Are you generally a happy, chatty person? Are you generally a quiet person? What's your energy level normally? You figure what your baseline is, and then you start to track if you have a difference from that lasts generally more than a couple of weeks. So if, for example, I experience a clinical depression, me and my wife, we notice it. Oh, something, I'm low and I'm not feeling well, and it's not lifting, and it's not based on frustration with work or with anything else. I think I might be getting into a depressive phase. So I start to watch it. If it lasts for 2 or 3 weeks, I literally put it on a chart. And I would recommend anyone interested in looking for these tools, just Google mood and life charts. Just that phrase. If you Google that, and the reason I'm not going to give any one particular resource is because I want you to find the one that speaks to you, that makes the most sense to you. But I did it recently. I Googled mood and life charts, and there were several really useful tools that you might use. And I certainly have found that has helped me to understand my illness and maintain it. And the other tools are things I spoke about at the beginning, like eating well and drinking in moderation and getting exercise. And that last one can be very tough. If you are watching this and you're in the middle of a clinical depression, you, I'm sure, are thinking, yeah, get exercise. Thanks, buddy. That's hard to do. I feel awful. I'm exhausted. How am I going to get exercise? I've been there. I know what it's like, and it's extremely hard. But I found that the good days when I was depressed were the days I got out for a walk, even if it was only a 20-minute walk or a 10-minute walk, but just physically engage as much as the depression will allow you to. And I found that helped to move forward and to minimize it. It's not like a quick fix, an immediate fix, but it did help in general. And when you're well, maintain a good energy level with physicality, with being physically active. I found that very important. And the last tool, Zaheen, I would say is simply, if you are like me and you do need a treatment, because not everyone does need a medical treatment, a pill to take to treat their mental illness, but if you do, take it. If you find one that works, like I have been taking the same medication now since 2005, and I've chosen to do that because it has worked for me. And it's called compliance, is when you are ill with a mental illness or any illness and you're willing to take the treatment regularly. I take it regularly. I don't resent it. I don't let it bother me because it has helped me. I view it as a tool that has helped me to be well. So if you're someone who needs a treatment and has found one that works, don't fall into that trap of, well, I'm well, so I don't need the treatment. I often say to people, would you ever ask a diabetic who needs to take insulin every day, have you ever thought about stopping your insulin? I mean, you seem fine. Well, of course that wouldn't work because the insulin is what is making them be okay. And in my case, the medication I take is a necessity. And for those of you that it is, don't let that get to you, because I view it as we need to be grateful that we found a treatment that worked. So those are the 5 big ones.
Awesome. So I'm just going to recap those.
Thank you.
So it's empathy, track, so that's your sleep or your mood.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you want to know about mood, you can get the mood and life charts that Jason spoke about and just Google them.
Yeah.
And then 3 is eating well. 4 is exercise, and even start with a walk for 15 to 20 minutes. And then the last one is treatment.
Yeah.
Okay, wow, time has flown, Jason. So I really want you to tell the viewers and the listeners how they can get a hold of you. And you have a freebie for them. So please go ahead and offer that.
Thank you very much. So you see underneath at the bottom of the screen, you see my website, empowerproservices.com. If you go there, I recommend that you go to the blog page. When you find that, at the top right of the blog page is a subscription form for the Empower e-newsletter. If you sign up for that, you will automatically and immediately receive an email with a PDF, which I call the stigma-free checklist. Now, what this checklist does for you is it's very easy to go through. It doesn't take very long. It's designed for workplaces and schools. And if you can answer the questions and the checklist guides you through, you will know immediately, is stigma having a negative impact in your workplace or in your school? And if it is, then my argument is that you need to do something about it, that there needs to be action taken, because understanding mental illness is one thing, but really finding a way to address stigma and reduce it is, I believe, the barrier that's stopping us from getting all the way when it comes to overcoming this. Because we can't stop we can't stop mental illness from occurring. It will happen, but we can reduce the stigma that surrounds it. Yes. So again, that's my website, the blog page of my website. Subscribe to the Empower e-newsletter, and you will get this in an email immediately after, the stigma-free checklist.
Awesome. And I'll make sure that I also put that in the show notes. So you will have the website and the instructions on how to get that. Well, I can't believe it's already 6:30 my time, so that's half an hour gone. And I had so much fun talking to you, and fun in a sense that I got to know more, and I got to look back in my own life, to figure out where could I have done better, especially when it came with my loved one. So Jason, thank you so much for again being on the show, and I just wish you all the best. And again, you all heard, make sure you go on his website, empowerproservices.com. You go to his blog and enter your name and email in there to get your checklist. And this is a great gift that he offered to all of you. So make sure you do that. And for those of you listening again, episode number 23 will be on May 8th. And on May 8th, we'll have another guest who is going to talk about his life, where he went through a brutal accident, and the doctors had said, hey, he's not going to live anymore, but he proved them wrong. And there's more to his story, but I'm going to let you come on the show and listen to that and watch it so that you can get inspired. And that's what Thrive in Life is all about. It's about inspiring you to be your best. Now go do it. Bye.